Tonight we are in Genesis 49. Genesis 49. And I guess this will be the last Sunday evening for me in this study through Genesis. Jesse will close the study out, I guess next Sunday evening, or the next Sunday evening that's set aside for this particular. That's the right one? Okay. All right. I have thoroughly enjoyed going through Genesis, and I hope that you have as well. It's time also for our youth to take their Bible Bowl tests and Pearls tests, and so I hope that we have, if not helped them in prepping for the tests, at least help them in recognizing the significance of the story of Genesis beyond just, hey, know this word for the test. We're going to move quickly tonight. We're in Genesis 49, and we're looking at Jacob blessing his sons. And so this is probably one of those chapters that we kind of have a tendency to sort of skip over because it bogs down the narrative. It bogs down the story of Joseph a little bit, right? Because when you pick back up in chapter 50, after Jacob has died, then you have more interaction with Joseph and his brothers, and you have sort of that pinnacle statement that is the theme, which is, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And that theme then of God's purposes unfolding, and God taking all of these things that we've been studying in Genesis and unraveling them into His own plan and His own purpose to eventually bring Christ into the world. And then you have, in the midst of that, this chapter 49, which is Jacob laying hands on his 12 sons and blessing them. But it's more than just a blessing. And blessing is interesting throughout your Old Testament because it was very common for a father, a patriarch, not even just these patriarchs that we're talking about, but the father of a household or the head of a clan to sort of pass along an inheritance as he is dying and sort of leave a blessing. But what's significant about Jacob and what we saw with the other biblical patriarchs is that it's not just about the inheritance that they're passing down, it's about the more significant inheritance, which is they're passing along God's promises, right? And so it kind of started in Genesis 3:15, but it started as a blessing to pass down with Abraham in Genesis 12 and the covenant in Genesis 15. I'll make of you a great nation. There's this promise of land. There's this promise of protection. There's this idea that through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. And we know that that refers to the coming of the Christ, the coming of the Messiah. And so, but Genesis 49 is extremely significant in that regard. Because what's happening is, at this point, we are beginning that shift. We're making this transition from patriarch to patriarch to patriarch to a nation, right? So part of the promise to Abraham is, I'll make of you a great nation. Well, now, and we've gone from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, but now we're making this shift to 12 tribes that come from these 12 sons. And of those 12 tribes then become the nation of Israel. And so this is the transition to national Israel. And of course, they don't become an official nation till they're brought out of Egypt. And, you know, the wandering in the wilderness and the conquest of the land of Canaan. And there's a lot of history that's there. But this is that transition from patriarch to patriarch to patriarch to nation. And it's prophetic as well. As he goes through and he talks about, or he passes a blessing on to each of his sons, God is clearly revealing to him and through him something predictive about their futures. And so it's really more than we can talk about in any kind of detail tonight, but I just want to emphasize how prophetic it is and how you can go forward in the story and you can see these things unfold. And the reason for that, what's the point of God through Jacob declaring that? Well, part of it is a reminder to his sons and to the generations that follow that this is not ending. The Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, this isn't ending with God's plans and God's purposes. And the fact that there is more to be said and that there's more going forward, right, is a reminder to them, both the good and the bad are going to be used by God to fulfill His purposes and keep His promises. And so let's look at Genesis 49. And also, this is, Jacob is, to me, one of the most interesting characters of this, and this also completes Jacob's development arc. The Hebrews writer in Hebrews 11, he goes through, by faith, so-and-so did this, and by faith, so-and-so did this. Well, the thing that he highlights about Jacob is the passing of blessing to Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And so the point seems to be that this is finally where Jacob shows the faith that he's supposed to have in God's plans and purposes and promises. And so it completes the story arc of Jacob, not just because he does this just before he dies, but because it finally reveals that Jacob, as a guy who has continually tried to do it on his own, has gotten it. That it's not about him accomplishing anything, it's about God's purposes and God's plan and what God is going to do. So chapter 49 says, Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come." And the time frame going forward is like some of this seems to occur for some of them a little earlier in the conquest of the land of Canaan or in the time of the judges. Some of them reach a little further into the time of David and the kingdom. But, right, what will happen to you in days to come. He says, "Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel your father." The first one he mentions is Reuben in verse 3. Now what I did to make this easier for me is I went through chapter 49 and I underlined each of the sons. And so verse 3 is Reuben, verse 5 is Simeon and Levi, verse 8 is Judah, and so forth. And so you might consider doing that if you mark in your Bible. I can look down and just see those names pop off the page, and so I know right where each one of them is. But we start with the firstborn, Reuben. He says in verse 3, "You are my firstborn, my might and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power." Starting out by this is just sort of the normal, natural way of reflecting upon the firstborn in that time, especially when it was the firstborn who sort of perpetuated the family name, the family wealth, the family business, the family heritage. And the firstborn would receive the larger portion of inheritance, right? And so just naturally, because he is the firstborn, the thought is he's preeminent, right? But then he says, "Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch." Now this is a reference back to Genesis 35 verse 22, which doesn't give you really much more information than that, other than just to quickly say that on this occasion, while Jacob was traveling, Reuben, his oldest son, went and slept with one of his concubines. And it says that Jacob heard about it, or Jacob found out about it. And it doesn't say anything else. That's it. Except now, in this blessing or in this declaration of what's going to happen, Jacob lets us know that it is going to cost Reuben his preeminence as firstborn. It's going to cost him that inheritance. It's pretty significant. Proverbs 6:32 and 33. We won't take time to read it, but it gives a pretty strong declaration against the man who would commit adultery, right? But also, this story kind of also reminds us of a New Testament issue where Paul writes to the church at Corinth, and he says, you know, you have among you, you're tolerating somebody among you who has his father's wife. And he says that that's not even heard of among the Gentiles, right? And so it really kind of puts in your head this idea that, wow, this is a pretty significant issue. This is a pretty big defilement that has taken place. I'm particularly drawn to the phrase unstable as water. Unstable as water. That particular word, unstable, is not used anywhere else in the Scriptures. And it seems to mean boiling over like water. So here is Reuben boiling over like water. And we don't really know anything other than this reference to this happening. So instability is very much your lusts boiling over, right? Our fleshly desires, when we let those fleshly desires be what motivate us, be what lead us, be what drive us, then we let them boil over. We don't keep the lid on them. We don't keep them under control. And I'm sure we've all had a pot on the stove that boiled over and it makes a mess. And that's what Reuben did. And that's what happens when we don't get control of our fleshly desires. It will boil over. We are unstable because we're not in control of those things. And it cost Reuben the preeminence. So as you go forward in the history of the tribes of Judah, you don't really read about the tribe of Reuben. You have Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, who are tribes that you read about, but Reuben is not there. And so, pretty significant issue thinking about adultery and thinking about this kind of thing that this man engaged in. And then you come to, in verse 5, Simeon and Levi. So these are two brothers that are put together in this declaration, in part because they acted together in an event in Genesis 34. Now, we'll just listen to what he says here. He says, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Wow. So you go back to Genesis 34 and you read what they did. There was a Canaanite who raped their sister. And Jacob didn't do anything about it. And, I think it's in Ecclesiastes where it's said that when justice isn't executed swiftly, then this is the kind of thing that's likely to happen, because people crave justice and they want to see evil punished. And if those who are able to and are responsible don't do something about injustice, then it leads to vigilantism. It gives rise to that kind of thing. Not that there's any application for any of that in our society today, right? But their sister is raped, and then the man who does that, he holds her, he keeps her And he gets with his father, the ruler of that particular community, town, city. They had city kings kind of in these places. And he wants his father to make arrangements with Jacob for this daughter to be made his wife. He got the cart way before the horse, right? And yet now he's like madly in love with her. I have to have her for my wife. And so they try to make these negotiations, and Simeon and Levi, they're not happy with this at all. So they kind of work in this negotiation that, okay, look, you know, there's this problem of you're kind of these heathen people, and we're the descendants of Abraham. And so if any kind of marriage is going to happen, then you're going to have to be circumcised. But not just you, the whole town, the whole city. And these idiots are like, okay. And so there's a day where this whole town, all of the men in this town are circumcised. And Simeon and Levi then come in, and the text says, while they're still sore, Simeon and Levi come in and slaughter all of them. Kill all of the men and take the spoils from the town. And the hint here in this sort of blessing on them is that this was done in wrath, and this was done in anger, and that this was violence that was vengeance and wrath that came out. I have to admit, I struggle a little bit with it, because when you read it in Genesis 34, you're kind of like, justice is served. That's kind of the way you feel as you go through it. And it's like, and I mean, these guys aren't playing checkers, they're playing chess, you know, to pull that off and make that happen. And it's like, but who was the one who actually committed this heinous offense? That one guy, right? And justice is not to, in turn, slaughter a whole village, right? That's wrath gone too far. So the story isn't about that justice shouldn't have been addressed, or justice shouldn't have been handled with regards to Dinah, their sister, but that this wasn't justice. This was far beyond that. I would say that it is extremely important and is always the necessary thing for men to protect women and children. Jacob should have had some action with regards to what happened to his daughter. And the brothers had a responsibility as well. And today, when we see injustices, especially upon those who are the most vulnerable, it is imperative that we protect them. And any man who will abuse women and children is no man at all. And if we will not protect them, then that calls into question manliness as well. However, that does not mean that you burn the whole village down, right? And so we have to be careful not to execute wrath and vengeance, but to pursue justice and protection. And there's a difference in those two things. And so Simeon and Levi will be scattered. And you can move forward and you can see some of that happen in their history. However, there is an interesting twist with Levi, the tribe of Levi, because in Exodus 32, you remember Moses comes down off the mountain and there's this whole disaster of that worshiping the golden calf. It's like, just brought you out of Egypt, right? And and now while I'm up on the mountain talking to God, you make a calf. Well, it was the tribe of Levi that stood alongside Moses when that happens. And so there's almost a bit of a redemption story in there as well now with the tribe of Levi. And of course, from them also now they're given the priesthood after that, or out of them the priests come following that. So interesting stories there. Verse 8 then, so you got Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, and then you've got Judah in verse 8. Your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion, as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. We don't know exactly what some of the details of that mean, but we do know that Judah becomes the kingly tribe. They become a very powerful and very prominent tribe, and it is from them that you have King David, and it is from them that you have the line of kings, and it is from that lineage of David that you have the King, Jesus the Christ. And that's the significance then of the tribe of Judah and of that scepter. And so you pick that up even going into Matthew chapter 1, where the lineage of Christ is traced through David. And then you've got in verse 13, Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea and shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be at Sidon. What's interesting about that is the portion of the land that Zebulun gets is not actually on the sea, but a significant trade route goes right through the land that Zebulun gets. And so all the things that come in from the sea go through them to be traded to other places. In verse 14 you have Issachar. Issachar is a strong donkey. I mean, wouldn't you love that? What Dad calls you in and he goes, "Son, you are a strong donkey." Crouching between the sheepfolds, or saddlebags, depending upon which translation, he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant at forced labor. So there's some idea that the land that they got was a valley between two mountains, and so these are the between the sheepfolds or the saddlebags, however that interpretation is. But notice, became a servant at forced labor. They were a strong donkey, but they bowed their shoulder. They laid down, and because of that, were forced to labor. Dan, verse 16, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that his rider falls backward. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. Some question about what this one in particular means, but it seems to be that they would be stronger than their size, but they would face a lot of turmoil. There'd be a lot of conflict. And so that's why there's almost this little prayer for, I wait for your salvation. They're going to be in a lot of distress, and there's a lot of fighting, and they're stronger than their size, but I pray for them. Right? Verse 19, raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. So a lot of turmoil going on there, and raiding and being raided. And from the position that they end up in on the land, it's kind of like they don't push out all of the people that they're supposed to push out when they take the land of Canaan. And so they're constantly, and that's what the book of Judges reflects, there's constantly invading, and it seems like Gad took the brunt of some of that. Verse 20, Asher's food shall be rich, he shall yield royal delicacies. They say that this particular, the land that Asher got is probably a place where a lot of agriculture happened that actually provided some of the nicer foods and things to even some of the kings of the land of Canaan before they're completely destroyed, but especially to the nation going forward. Verse 21, Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. There's some question about the translation of that and what it refers to, and even if it's positive or negative. So you can look that up and study that on your own. Joseph then, verse 22. Joseph, that's who we've been studying, right? Joseph is the reason why Jacob has ended up in Egypt. So listen to what he says about Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Boy, that's clearly already happened, right? All of the struggle that Joseph has gone through. Yet, his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, by the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. It's kind of interesting looking back at how he was set apart, kind of through the pushing away and through all of the negatives, right? Joseph is set apart physically and separated from the other 12 through all of the persecution and all of the difficulties and all of the challenges that he faced. And now he is set apart from them in blessing. And that's exactly what Jesus talks about with us. That we humble ourselves and we submit to Him, right? And it separates us, it sets us apart, but it is Him then who exalts us, puts us in a position of glory. And this is the story of Joseph, right? But we'll pause right here and we'll back up to chapter 48. Because before going through all of these sons, Jacob has already blessed Joseph's two sons. I mentioned them already, Ephraim and Manasseh. And they do become part of the 12 tribes that you read about going forward. In fact, they become very significant tribes. If we were to look at sort of the map of the land that gets divided up, Ephraim and Manasseh have a huge portion of that land. And you can read the census that was taking place in the book of Numbers, and you read about the size of Ephraim and Manasseh. But back in chapter 48, so what you don't read about is the tribe of Joseph, right? Because it's split into Ephraim and Manasseh. But when you back up into 48, one of the key verses is verse 5. Because when they bring the two sons of Joseph to Jacob, it makes clear that Jacob is losing his eyesight. He can't see very well. And so he kind of asks, are these your sons? And it's not just because he can't see very well. It's because of verse 5. And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. So chapter 48 isn't just Jacob blessing Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Chapter 48 is Jacob formally adopting them as his own sons in terms of this inheritance. And so it wasn't just then that he's passing down the inheritance to Joseph and then that portion would be for Ephraim and Manasseh. Oh no. He is giving them a portion as though they are his own sons. And maybe that reflects some of what of his particular fondness for Joseph, right? That goes all the way back in the story. But when he does, as you read chapter 48, he crosses his hands when he blesses them. Right? So there's this picture of being on the right hand of. That is the picture of prominence, if you're on the right hand, preeminence, if you're on the right hand of somebody. And we even still sort of carry that forward today, right? We'll talk about somebody's right-hand man. But what Jacob does when he blesses Joseph's two sons is he swaps his hands. And he gives the preeminence to the younger one. And in something that's very ironic, it makes Joseph quite angry with his father that he's intentionally doing this. He's like, no, you got it wrong. And Jacob goes, no, I know what I'm doing. I may be going blind, but I know what I'm doing in this. And what's ironic about that is, well, Joseph is nowhere near the oldest himself. And look at the position of preeminence that's given to him. And actually, right, that's a part of the Old Testament story. I mean, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau. And I know there's more to that story than just that, but Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph over his brothers. Like that's a theme. And you may remember that Paul talks in Corinthians about the wisdom of God in choosing the things that the world deems as foolishness. Right? And so what the tendency would have been for human beings would have been to go with the oldest in the preeminence, right? But what God continually did was use the younger, right? God just does things differently than we would be inclined to do. And Paul says that that's the wisdom of God. So sometimes before we are quick to dismiss the things that God has chosen, the things that God has selected, and we want to go, well, I think this would be a better way. Well, just remember that you and I are fools, and God is the one with the wisdom. And so when God makes the selection, maybe if it's about being baptized into water, or singing instead of using any kind of instrument, or whatever it is that God picks and God chooses, it's not always what man and man's infinite wisdom would select. But that's a theme. That shouldn't be surprising. That's what God does. The things that the world deems as foolishness, God uses and God exalts. And that's part of this theme and part of this story. But look at the blessing that he does offer. Down in verse 20. So he blessed them, Ephraim and Manasseh, that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. In other words, they would be going forward an outstanding example to everybody else of divine blessing. Right? So it's like going forward, it's almost like people could say, I hope God blesses you like He does Ephraim and Manasseh. If more of us would be Josephs, right? Who dealt with suffering admirably, who were honorable, who were obedient, who were submissive, who were resistant to temptation, right? All of the things that we've seen Joseph in the story of Joseph. I wonder if our children wouldn't be that much more blessed and maybe be the kind of example that Ephraim and Manasseh then are said to be of God's blessing. Then you go back to 49. Verse 27 ends with Benjamin, the youngest. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. Yeah, see, that's what the son wants to hear his father say. Not you're a donkey, but you're a ravenous wolf. And what's cool about this is Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, there are a couple of times going forward where there is mention of people from the tribe of Benjamin being mighty warriors. And especially is there emphasis given to their use of the bow and the sling. And 1 Chronicles 12 and verse 2 especially talks about them being able to be proficient with the bow and the sling, whether using the right hand or the left. It's a pretty big deal. And so they're like ravenous wolves. They are the warriors going forward. So again, this is very interesting, right? To think about this prophetic picture of the but why? What's the point? What's the value there? Well, again, here we are moving forward in God's plan. Look at what's happening. God is making of Abraham what? A great nation. And these tribes are that transition to that great nation. And most importantly, look at what God is able to accomplish and what God is able to do, regardless of how men behave, right? Here's the closing thought or closing question, though. God's will is going to be done. Are you going to be blessed or are you going to be cursed in the unfolding of God's will? And that depends on whether God can use you in your obedience or whether God has to use you in your rebellion. Because either way, God's will is going to be done. Do you want to be used in blessing? Or do you want to be used in cursing? And that's the part where my will comes into play and my decisions come into play. Not that I'm going to thwart God's will or not that God can't do it without me, but it's about what part do I want to be in it? What role do I want to play? Am I willing to be like Joseph? Right? Rather than being one of these examples of the cursing that even God still uses to carry out His will, but I want to be a beneficiary of God's blessings, not have God's will fulfilled in spite of me, right? And so we encourage you to respond this evening if you need to be obedient to the gospel, or if as a Christian maybe you see yourself giving into sin. Maybe you see yourself being unstable and letting your lust take over. Maybe you see yourself giving rise to your anger and letting that rule you. Let's make sure that we're the recipients of blessings. If you need to respond, we encourage you to do so while we stand and sing. Bring Christ your bride.
Father, we pray that our worship here tonight is acceptable in your sight. Pray that it is according to your will, that it is satisfied your needs as it is satisfied ours. Lord, thank you for this morning of worship and our safe travels there, our safe travels here. Thank you for all of those blessings, physical blessings that you give us every day. Thank you for the blessing of the place where we live and the congregation that we go to have such a loving and supportive congregation, Father. We know is not it's rare, Father. So thank you for that, and thank you for the blessings that you give us. Father, being in such a loving and supportive congregation is such a blessing in times of need and in times of grief, Father. Pray that you'll be with this congregation, be with the family, and the loss of a brother that we love dearly and that loved this church and did a lot of work for you, Lord, and that I believe that definitely a lot of young men and women look up to be more like you and more like your son. Pray you'll be with us to that time. Thank you for your son. Thank you for his sacrifice. Thank you for his willingness and his willingness to go through pain so that we may not have to. When we sing songs of praise, when we celebrate the death of our brothers and sisters as they find eternal life with you, we know that's not possible without the pain and suffering